So it's absolutely my pleasure to introduce our keynote speaker, who I just did the math this week, is my friend of over 20 years. Which, wow, I didn't believe that until I did the math. Dr. Tyina Steptoe, who is an associate professor of history at the University of Arizona. Her research and teaching focus on race, gender, and popular culture in the United States. She's the author of Houston Bound, Culture and Color in a Jim Crow City, published by UC Press in 2016, and which won awards from the Urban History Association, the Western History Association, and the Houston Metropolitan Research Center. I'm reading the bio that she gave me, but I'm gonna add and say that it is one of the most important books in Texas history. And Western history, and it speaks directly to things that came up yesterday about Texas as Southern and Western. And it will be available for sale during today's pop-up book sale. Dr. Steptoe is also a DJ on Tucson Community Radio, which is streaming at www.kxci.org. Her show, Soul Stories, explores the roots and branches of rhythm and blues music on Saturday afternoons. She is currently writing a gender history of rhythm and blues. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Tyina Steptoe.
Good afternoon, everybody. I hope y'all enjoyed your lunch. I've got a tofu banh mi waiting for me right after this. Good to hear that. So thank you to Mark Goldberg and Josh Furman for inviting me. And very special thanks to Dr. Kanter for sponsoring this keynote. So as Dr. Goldberg said, I write about race and ethnicity in this city, Houston, Texas. And it's a book that is kind of centered around African-American migration to the city. But as I very quickly realized when I started writing that, African-American history here in Houston isn't isolated, right? There are all of these multi-ethnic, multi-racial conversations that went on in the city of Houston and that still do. So I was really interested in how this very diverse city that you're all in today took shape. When were the changes? And first, I just want to ask, is there anyone here who's from Houston? Okay, good number of historians here this afternoon. So then, you may recognize this man. Who is this? I knew that was coming too. Marvin Zindler, born in 1921, left us in 2007. And he was the one who on Friday nights, I believe it was, would tell us which restaurants had clean kitchens and which ones had. Absolutely. The name Zindler is synonymous with Houston. So much so that when I went to the archives, the Houston Metropolitan Research Center, I immediately ran across the name Zindler. And at first I thought, that can't be. And I realized that I was reading about his grandparents. So one of the first names that I came across in the context of his family store, Ben Zindler's and Sons, sometimes just called Zindler's, sometimes Zindler's Sons, after his son Abe took over the store. So Ben Zindler was Marvin's grandfather. His father Abe ran the store throughout the 1920s. Marvin decided to take a different path and go into television. When I started writing about Houston, right, it became the book Houston Bound, Culture and Color in a Jim Crow City. That's blues musician Lightnin' Hopkins walking through Third Ward on the cover. And it's a cultural history of how migration shaped ideas about race and ethnicity in Houston, starting around World War I and wrapping up during the Civil Rights era in the 1960s. And when I started the project, my main question was, how did segregation work in a city as diverse as Houston? Right? And when we think about things like Jim Crow, which I'm from Houston originally, and I knew from hearing my grandparents' stories that there was a legal form of segregation that operated here in Houston. I heard stories about my grandparents sitting at the back of the bus, right, or not being able to enter certain spaces. So I knew that it was a Jim Crow city, but then with the diversity that I grew up with here, I thought, how do you segregate a population like Houston? The first thing I learned is that this has not always been a multiracial, multi-ethnic city. The Houston that I grew up in didn't look a lot like the place that I was reading about in the early 20th century. Before World War I, Houston was largely a biracial black and white city where Anglo-Texans, right, white Christian Texans with roots in the Southeast usually, made up the majority, and black Texans were about a third to half of the population, depending, right? Very large. Houston was almost half black immediately following Reconstruction, and then by World War II was about a third. And whether black or white, most Houstonians had roots in the American South. Right? And I think going back to that question of, is Houston Southern or Western? I think a lot of people here identified as Southern because their ancestors moved from the Southeast westward, right? And this is a chart of residents' place of birth in Freedmanstown. And I'm going to talk a little bit more about that community. But Freedmanstown was the first black community here in Houston, the first free black, I should say, formed during Reconstruction immediately following the Civil War, right? If you look, the majority born in Texas, but then it's like a map of the South, right? All of these people from everywhere else. And that was largely due to the interstate slave trade right before the Civil War. So this chart depicts the population in 1870. 5 years after the Civil War. So these weren't people who had moved since the war. They were people whose families had been forced west due to the slave trade. And of those people who were born in Texas, the overwhelming majority had parents who had been born in one of those other states. One thing that also made Houston seem very Southern, I think, by the early 20th century, was the city's racial geography. The first free black community was Freedmanstown, located in the 4th Ward. And in the 1800s, the city was spatially divided into 6 different wards. All right, if you can see, there are 6 wards. They surround downtown. And 4th Ward is the one that's in the southwest there. All right, so these wards functioned fairly independently in Houston. Each ward got to elect one representative who served on the city council, and that person kind of informally acted as a kind of mayor of the ward. Now, within each ward, there are different pockets of populations. So in Houston, there wasn't, say, a black belt, right, that developed. Instead, there was a black community in every single ward. The first is 4th Ward, and then 3rd Ward very quickly there at the south develops one. And then all over, every ward had its own black area, usually a black economic district. And because of segregation, black schools, black businesses as well. And that's very similar to other southern cities, where you tend to have a more geographically dispersed black population. Whereas when you leave the South, say, and go to some northern cities or even some places in the West, there tends to be a black belt, right, at one area. So this sort of racial geography kind of links Houston spatially to southern cities like Atlanta or Richmond, Virginia. So during and after World War I, converging sets of migrations altered the city's demographics. The Black population grew, but became even more diverse. In the 1920s, there's an influx of French-speaking Catholic Creoles of color who moved here from southwestern Louisiana. They were usually the rural Cajun country population, and they moved both because of the Great Mississippi Flood of 1927, but also because the Southern Pacific Railroad recruited Creole men to move to Houston to work for it. So then, within the category of Black, suddenly there are all these French-speaking Catholic migrants who are coming in from Louisiana. And at the same time, there's an increasing number of people of Mexican descent, right? Both people who were coming north from Mexico during the Mexican Revolution, but also a large group of Tejanos who were moving into Houston, especially from South Texas, moving in. And I will combine those two groups as ethnic Mexican throughout this talk. And this was a major demographic shift in Houston. The first thing that really shocked me when I was writing about this city is the fact that the ethnic Mexican population was less than 1% in the early 20th century. So immediately a new research question formed. Okay, how and why, and how did that shake things up? And that number grew, of course, steadily over subsequent decades, and by the end of the 20th century, the Latinx population was the largest in the city of Houston. So the growth of the Creole and ethnic Mexican communities really shaped culture in Houston, in that it brought a lot of Catholicism into the city, right? And suddenly you start seeing newspaper articles about Catholics and the Catholic religion. The Jewish population of Houston had experienced recent growth, and of course, Jewish people were present at the city's founding in 1836. But most of the population had its origins in the wave of immigration in the late 19th century through World War I, before severe immigration restrictions passed by Congress. And some Jewish families came to Houston as a kind of a secondary migration. They'd come to Galveston first, and then after the Galveston flood, moved into Houston. So in the 20s, there is more growth of Jewish Houston, but a lot of them, including one of the families I'm going to talk about today, came from Galveston. And I do see in the program that there's an immigration panel at 2 o'clock, and one of the papers is actually on Galveston. So I'd be very interested in that. So as you may know, the Jewish population was relatively small in the 1920s, about 2%. Yet what I found when I started looking through newspapers is that they factored into the racial discourse of the time, even if the population was relatively small. Now, because of the influx of all of these diverse groups, questions of race and culture in Houston started to become a more multi-ethnic and multilingual conversation than it had been before. So that's when I decided the starting point of this book is going to be World War I and the 1920s after, because that seemed to be a period of major transition. So today my talk mostly focuses on race and ethnicity in the 1920s, with a focus on the way that Jewish Houstonians were part of an economic, spatial, as well as cultural relationship with Black and ethnic Mexican Houstonians. And also the ways that these relationships brought fear, suspicion, and backlash in the 20s. Now, when I first entered the archives to research Houston, as I said, Zindler was one of the first names that I ran across. I started looking at newspapers to just get a sense of what was going on in the city during particular times. And that's how the Zindlers came into the story. I first ran across the name while reading a newspaper called the Houston Informer. The Informer was founded in 1919 by 2 Black men who had migrated to Houston from East Texas, right? And a lot of the migrants to Houston who were black, who were not coming from Louisiana, were coming in from East Texas towns. C.F. Richardson was from Marshall, Texas, and he became the editor of The Informer in 1919. Articles in the paper focused on issues faced by other black Houstonians, especially those who were coming in from rural parts of Louisiana and East Texas who were acclimating to a bigger city. And the vast majority of articles in The Informer talked about race, especially the long battle against Jim Crow. As with any newspaper, The Informer's financial health depended on ads. In the 1920s, a number of those ads were placed by Jewish businessmen. Two stores that I frequently saw in the Informer were Ben Zindler's store and also a store called Sakowitz that some of you Houstonians will recognize. The Zindler family arrived to the United States in the late 1880s, and Ben Zindler operated a tailoring shop in downtown Houston until his death. Abe Zindler Jr. took over the family business. The Sakowitz family immigrated from a Ukrainian town in the Russian Empire in 1886. They first arrived to New York City, but then they heard about opportunities on Galveston Island, and that's how they came to Texas. They opened their first store in Galveston in 1902 and opened their first Houston store in 1917. Sakowitz and Zindler and Sons advertised in The Informer in the 1920s. Oh, and this is the Sakowitz Brothers store. It was located on the corner of Main and Preston in 1917. It was there in the 20s. So they placed ads in The Informer. All right, this is from Ben Zindler's Sons, very 20s, right? Attention, young men, get your jazz suits, right? Very snazzily dressed young man there. It's the suit of the hour for young men. They're classy and brimful of style. Try one on, you'll like it, and you pay Zindler only $39.50. I also noticed that each year, Zindler's and Sakowitz place specialized ads for the black holiday of Juneteenth. All right, so Juneteenth celebrates Emancipation Day in Texas, June 19 of 1865. It very recently became a national holiday, but in the context of the 1920s, it was still very much a black holiday. And one thing I found very interesting about this is in the mainstream Anglo-owned newspapers, the Post, the Chronicle, as well as some of the newspapers that I found in places like Austin, those newspapers tended to ridicule Juneteenth, right? I found numerous examples of that where they made fun of things like, well, nobody's maids will be at work today, or making racial jokes about the food that would be consumed there. Whereas in The Informer, you see Sakowitz and Zindler's Sons acknowledging the significance of the holiday by sportswear for Juneteenth, right? Or Sakowitz says, this store has anticipated all your Juneteenth needs and will be glad to serve you, as in previous years. So there is across Houston this acknowledgement of Juneteenth, but the way that it's acknowledged, right, is very different. So these ads show an awareness of both black cultural trends and black cultural expressions, right? Suits influenced by jazz, a holiday that at that point was still largely observed by black Texans. Now, all of this is happening in the 1920s. These ads in particular are from June of 1929. All right, so it caught the attention of Houston's local chapter of the Ku Klux Klan. The Klan had a resurgence during World War I, and it was the second version of the organization, as you may know. The first version of the KKK formed during Reconstruction immediately after the Civil War at about 1866. And their main goal during Reconstruction was to derail the political, social, and economic ambitions of the formerly enslaved Black South. The Klan had largely died away as an organization in the 1870s due to federal prosecution. Though, as we know, the racial violence didn't end, but the Klan as an organization, right, took different forms. The Klan reorganized and reemerged in 1915 with the first new chapter in Atlanta, Georgia. And of course, that Atlanta chapter organized over Thanksgiving weekend in 1915 after a screening of The Birth of a Nation, the film that celebrated the Reconstruction era Klan. 5 years later, in 1920, a Klan chapter emerged here in Houston. The Klan announced its presence in Houston during a march on October 9th of 1920. Klansmen paraded through Houston's Confederate Veterans Day parade. They carried banners that read, "We were here yesterday, 1866, and we are here today in 1920. We will be here forever." The Klan had a night parade that October of 1920, and the city blacked out all the lights in downtown. City police officers protected the marchers. The mayor joined. They chose the name Sam Houston Klan No. 1, and that's because it was the first new chapter of the Klan in the state of Texas, and the first one located west of the Mississippi River since Reconstruction. The Klan spread like wildfire through Houston. Some students at Rice Institute, which becomes Rice University, where we are today, even created a student chapter of the Klan. One of the most startling things I ran into during the research on the 1920s was a yearbook photo from Rice of the student Klan chapter. Now, there was some pushback from students on campus. The Rice student newspaper ridiculed it, right? But this just goes to show how much the Ku Klux Klan became part of the fabric of Houston during that time, right? So common, not hidden, right, that people knew that a mayor was a member. Students posed for a yearbook for it. And the Klan, as I'll talk about in this talk, also had a newspaper called Colonel Mayfield's Weekly that circulated here in the city. Now, the Klan targeted the Black, Jewish, and Catholic populations in Houston. And when I started researching the city, I wasn't surprised to learn that, right? It's fairly common knowledge that the Klan in the 20th century targeted those three groups, right? Anti-Catholicism, anti-Semitism, anti-Blackness. But what I found in Houston that complicated that history for me is the way that in Houston, the Klan kind of went after those groups simultaneously, right? It wasn't like they had just one anti-Semitic kind of agenda and then an anti-Black agenda over here. All of them kind of came together. And in a corner of the nation where a growing number of people didn't fit easily into that Black-white binary, one of the things that the Klan in Houston was concerned with is how do these newcomers, or the people that they saw as newcomers, how were they going to live in the Jim Crow city? Were they going to accept a hierarchy of white over Black, or would they destabilize it? And Houston's Klan was of the opinion that migrants to the city were going to destabilize white supremacy. The Klan in particular worked to derail any form of coalition building or an ethno-racial relationship between people who were Black and or Catholic and or Jewish. And they saw the ads that I showed you from Sakowitz and Zindler and Sons as being something that could potentially derail Jim Crow, because it was an economic and cultural relationship that benefited both groups economically, right? The advertising dollars helped the informer, but then the customers going to those stores, right? That helps the Jewish business owners. Also, the Klan saw those ads as evidence that people like Zindler and the Sakowitz family supported Black civil rights. Through their ads, Zindler's and Sakowitz brothers were helping to finance Black Houstonians' fight against Jim Crow. Now, for that to make sense, I have to talk a little bit about the informer. As I said earlier briefly, the informer was mostly concerned about race and the fight against segregation. And C.F. Richardson, the editor, had gained national notoriety when his newspaper debuted in 1919 because of his fearless attacks on white supremacy. Richardson's motto was "getting them told," right? And that was always in every article that he wrote. He referred to politicians who supported segregation by name. He published detailed accounts of Klan attacks. At one point, they got their hands on the names of people who had donated to the Klan, and they published it. Because of this, Black newspapers across the country would also reprint articles from the informer. So the Pittsburgh Courier, the Chicago Defender would run stories on Richardson. And in 1920, the Chicago Defender published a story on how the informer's offices had been vandalized after one of his articles on the Klan. The vandals stole their subscription records, destroyed advertising books. That's key. I think you know why. And also they destroyed the latest edition that had been awaiting distribution. Robed Klansmen would also harass people who were selling the informer on the streets. This didn't stop C.F. Richardson. He wrote an expose on the Klan for the informer in 1928 that especially drew attention because he talked about the support that the Klan had from local Houston politicians. That year in 1928, police officers stopped Richardson one night when he was driving alone on a dark road. They said they stopped him because of a broken headlight. The officers pulled him out of the car, severely beat him, and left him on the side of the road. He did survive, though he did die with scars and that needed 35 stitches. So the informer became known across the United States for its fearless reporting on Klan activity. And so that's why when Sakowitz or Zindler's advertised in that newspaper, the Klan saw that as being in support of those cause. Also, the Klan mounted a campaign against these stores to get them to stop advertising in the informer. They pressured Jewish business owners to pull their ads, a move that, if successful, would be a kind of two-pronged attack, right? You hurt the informer and you hurt Jewish business simultaneously. Now, according to the Richardson family, right, I found interviews with C.F. Richardson's family who said that there were some people who pulled their ads from the informer, but the Zindler family never did, right? They supported the informer throughout the entire run, and according to them, Abe Zindler joined the NAACP, the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People. And this made the Zindlers targets. I saw evidence of this in a newspaper called Colonel Mayfield's Weekly. Colonel Mayfield's Weekly was edited by a man named Billy Mayfield, and Billy Mayfield was a very vocal supporter of the Houston Ku Klux Klan. And he paid particular attention to any signs of coalition building or any type of relationship between the Black, Jewish, and Catholic population. And you know, when I started looking through Colonel Mayfield's Weekly, in fact, when I was at the archives to get the microfilm to look at it, one of the librarians there said, "You do know what this newspaper is about, right?" Before she would hand it over. And I said, I know, I'm ready for it. But the newspaper was full of violence, right? Mayfield reported on any time the Klan had attacked anyone, and they typically came from those groups, right? The headlines were always something about Negro this, Catholic that, Jewish this. So when I started the research, I had my little file folders, and I would make copies. Nothing was digitized at that point. And I would put the papers into file folders. So I said, I had a folder for anti-Catholicism, anti-Semitism, anti-Blackness, but then realized that I couldn't really use that because so many of the articles were attacking all three at the same time. So it was kind of hard to distinguish them. You know, it wasn't like they're going after one group at a time. They found ways to go after all three. Now, Billy Mayfield was also someone who had recently migrated to Houston from rural East Texas. And he always talked about Houston in terms of it being a new city, a growing city, and a dangerous city, right? And those dangers typically, in his view, came from the actions of Black, Catholic, and Jewish Houstonians. Editorials in 1921 openly taunted the Zindler family, right? They especially went after the Zindlers. And in 1921, the paper urged its readers to boycott their store. Now, I think that the reason that they specifically went after the Zindlers in 1921 was because they were the ones that never pulled their ads from the Informer, right? So the boycott tended to focus on them very specifically. Writers for Colonel Mayfield's Weekly claimed that sales at Zindler & Sons dipped because of their boycott, right? So they would gleefully say, "We're running old Zindler out of town." That didn't happen, of course, and they offered no evidence that their sales had dipped at all. But in addition to targeting the Zindlers, at the same time, articles in Colonel Mayfield's Weekly also focused on Jewish men that they accused of trying to build interethnic or interracial alliances. And at any given point, the alliances that they targeted tended to be economic, political, and cultural, or a combination of the three. For example, a 1922 article claimed that a man named Julius Rosenfeld had organized an organization called the Patriots of America. The Patriots of America was allegedly an economic venture. The writer of the 1922 article claimed that they, quote, or that they were directly made up of, quote, Jew peddlers, Negro truck drivers, and Mexicans who have been taking jobs away from good old American boys. The author urged readers to take action against the coalition, but as with most articles in Colonel Mayfield's Weekly, it was loose on the details. All right, so I immediately went to try to find, wait, what is this Patriots of America? I have not found anything or evidence of this organization at all. Most likely, I think the author designed this to arouse anxieties over the groups that they saw as newcomers and un-American. And again, an example of how the Klan's anti-Semitism, anti-Blackness, anti-Catholicism tended to target people from those groups at the same time. Now, in terms of racial law in Houston, Jewish and ethnic Mexican Houstonians were white by law, of course, right? The idea of ethnic Mexicans being white goes back to the 1848 Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo, right, which granted people of Mexican descent full U.S. citizenship on paper, right? But of course, in places like Texas, there were all sorts of segregationist practices against ethnic Mexicans. In South Texas, for example, there are segregated schools for ethnic Mexican children, right? They got around it by saying that the schools were based on language, that these were Spanish-speaking schools versus English-speaking schools, so that the segregation wasn't based on their ethnicity, but rather based on the language they spoke. But of course, as many historians have found, there were certainly English-speaking ethnic Mexican children who were segregated into the Spanish schools. Now, here in Houston, ethnic Mexican children tended to attend public schools that had been designated for white children when the population was still very small. As the population started to grow by the 1930s, there were elementary schools built in ethnic Mexican communities here in Texas, here in Houston. And so even though these groups are legally white, right, we could see that in the way that the Houston Klan went after all three at the same time, that they were conceptualizing them as non-white, certainly un-American. So then there are ways that segregation worked outside of legal categorization, right? You've got the legal category, but then the way that things played out socially, economically on the ground, right? For example, ethnic Mexicans legally had access to spaces that had been designated for white Houstonians, but brown-skinned ethnic Mexican people sometimes encountered stares or outright exclusion when they tried to enter those spaces. And again, the article on Patriots of America tells us a bit about that racialization. It certainly calls Jewish whiteness into question by portraying them as something different from Anglo-Texans and suggesting that in their political, economic, and cultural ambitions, that they were actually closer to Black and ethnic Mexican people because they were always grouped in together. They also, articles in this newspaper, portrayed Jewish Texans as a group that didn't follow the social norm, right? That was a common theme that I found when I was looking in the newspaper. Now, social cues in the South enforced a racial hierarchy, right? And for my research process, I did a lot of interviewing, right? I would sometimes take a recorder into a 90-year-old woman's kitchen and sit down, talk about her experiences here, because I wanted to catch the stories of people who may not have been written about in newspapers. And a common theme that people talked about were not just the Jim Crow laws, but the way that social custom also enforced this racial hierarchy. So for example, Black Houstonians having to cast their eyes downward, never look a white person directly in the face, or stepping off the sidewalk when white people passed, or when Black domestic workers went to work in a white home, they had to enter through a back door, right? The servant's entrance in the back, and never ever appear in the front of the house. Right, so then articles about Jewish people who built economic coalitions with Black Texans portrayed Jewish Southerners as somehow outside of those norms, right? So when I went to interview people, I decided to ask about that, right? I thought, was Colonel Mayfield making this up? Or did you actually feel that there was a difference sometimes when you talked to, say, someone who was Jewish or someone who was Italian, right? Fifth Ward in particular had a fairly sizable Italian community in it. And what I heard from people in oral histories somewhat confirmed what Colonel Mayfield said. And actually one of those came from my grandmother. My grandmother and my great-grandmother did day work, right? Domestic service in white homes during the day. And they called it day work to distinguish from the period of enslavement, right? Because they could leave at night and go back to their own home. They didn't live in the house. So they kind of called it day work. And what they said, and plenty of the other people who did day work in Jewish homes, is they said, oh, no. When you worked at a Jewish house, you didn't have to do none of that nonsense. You could look them in the eye. You didn't have to go in. And my grandmother said she used to walk right up in the front and knock on the door when she arrived at work, right? And I was telling this to my husband. My husband grew up in Atlanta. His grandmother also did day work. She worked for a Jewish family in Atlanta, and she said that's why day work in Jewish homes was actually the one that everyone clamored for, right? Because you didn't have to go through those social cues. Same thing with some of the Italians who lived in Fifth Ward. There was an Italian family that ran a store in Fifth Ward, and Black people in Fifth Ward could walk right into the store, purchase things at the counter, have a conversation with the family, and leave, right? So in those oral histories, they kind of distinguished between, they would say, well, you know, Jewish and Italian people, they were white, but they weren't white, right? Is the way they would talk about it. White meant you had to follow some of those social norms. But for the Ku Klux Klan and people like Billy Mayfield, that made them non-white because they didn't enforce the social customs of Jim Crow, of the black-white color line in the same way. Also, in terms of demographics of some of the communities where Black and ethnic Mexican people lived, there was often a spatial proximity between Catholic immigrants from places like Italy as well as Jewish Houstonians. I mentioned earlier that there was an Italian store in Fifth Ward and many Italian families that lived around there. And in my census research, I looked at the census a lot, and I found that neighborhoods that had Black or ethnic Mexican majorities, when they had anyone in the neighborhood that the census taker marked as white, those people tended to be immigrants or first generation. And in many cases, most cases, Jewish or Italian families. And I'll give you a couple of examples. In Second Ward, which had the fastest growing ethnic Mexican population in the 20s, Second Ward, even though it became known as an ethnic Mexican community, was actually had a lot of diversity there. It was home to Houston's first Catholic church, built by ethnic Mexicans. It was Our Lady of Guadalupe, established in 1910. And other Mexican-owned businesses started to emerge in proximity to the Catholic parish. And so much so that by the 30s, people called the community El Segundo Barrio. Now, at the time, that neighborhood was also half Jewish and about a third Black when the ethnic population starts to grow, right? So all of these groups are living in very close proximity to one another. Another example comes from a place called Independence Heights. In 1905, a group of Black Houstonians started to move to Independence Heights. It was established as a neighborhood first. And then 10 years later, in 1915, Independence Heights became a Black town. Right? It was separate from Houston. It had a Black mayor, a Black sheriff, and it was just northwest of the city. So I looked through the census records for Independence Heights, and of course it did have a Black majority, but there were some families marked as white by the census taker who were living there. None of those families, none of the heads of the household were born in the United States or Texas. They were from Italy, Russia, and Poland. For example, Sam and Bertha Goldberg listed Russia and Poland as their places of birth. In case you're wondering, Independence Heights was reincorporated into Houston again in around 1928. And today it's about where the Studewood neighborhood is. Now, the multi-ethnic, multiracial population of some of these neighborhoods, places like Segundo Barrio, Independence Heights, possibly also heightened these concerns about mixture between these groups. Furthermore, Independence Heights was a visible sign of Black autonomy and Black political growth. If non-Black people lived there, it then suggested to some others that they didn't mind or they maybe even supported it. Were the Goldbergs of Independence Heights truly committed to maintaining a hierarchy of white over Black if they lived in a place that had a Black mayor? So then I think all of this, when I looked at Colonel Mayfield's weekly and thought, you know, some of this is clearly made up. But then other aspects of the research, the census records, as well as some of the oral history, did kind of corroborate the idea that Black and ethnic Mexican Houstonians did relate to Jewish Houstonians in a slightly different way than they did with Anglos. Now, the examples I've given so far focus on economics and social issues, advertising dollars, economic coalition, mixed neighborhoods. But the Klan also showed suspicion over cultural ties between Blacks and Jews. Throughout the 20s, Colonel Mayfield's weekly especially targeted the motion picture industry, which was still very new at the time. But again, writers had allegations of multi-ethnic schemes that undermined segregation, right? And I found certainly evidence in other parts of the country, right, that there was a lot of anti-Semitism directed toward the fledgling motion picture industry because there were so many Jewish people who were producing, directing, writing. In Houston, the Klan tied that into their anti-Blackness. For example, they went after an actor from New Orleans, Ben Turpin. Turpin was very well known for his Catholicism. In fact, his actor friends used to make fun of him because of his devotion. But in the pages of Colonel Mayfield's weekly, they painted him as someone who miscegenated. They argued that he was starring in a movie that had, as they put it, a dusky actress. And that Turpin was supposed to be in love with this dark-skinned woman. And they pointed out that there were Jewish producers who were making these movies. Right, so again, another place where all of it is intertwined. They accused Jewish filmmakers of making movies that promoted interracial relationships, accused a Catholic man from New Orleans as being in it, and his love affair, they suggested, was with a Black woman. Again, can't find what movie they would have been referring to at the time, but again, that sort of triangle at how they target all three at once. And the newspaper's discussion of interracial relationships was really like one of the main things that they targeted, one of their main concerns. For example, they published a story in 1922 about a Black man who had attempted to assault a white woman in an East Texas town. And at the end of the article, they said the reason that Black men attack white women is because of Jewish movies they've been watching that give them these ideas that it's okay. I also found one article where they talked about Klansmen in Colorado County tarring and feathering a 22-year-old Jewish man. They said that he had despoiled a Gentile girl who worked in his parents' store. Now, of course, this was only 7 years after the lynching of Leo Frank in Georgia in 1915, and the same year as the Klan's rebirth, right? So you could see shades of that going on in Houston, which portraying both Black and Jewish men as sexual threats. And I found in 1923, this illustration in Colonel Mayfield's Weekly, the School of the Movie, all right? And over here on the end, supposed to be a Jewish professor who apparently is also a filmmaker. I do not know how he would have time for both. And then the influence of these Jewish produced movies, all right? Your Boy, Your Girl, right? So this idea that Jewish filmmaking was going to be something that harmed white women in this case. So then, when many of these stories, as I said, about any kind of multi-ethnic or multiracial collaboration, some of them may have been fabricated, right? Indeed, some of the stories of Klan attacks, I can't find evidence of either, right? So, but that could mean that those local newspapers in Colorado County, maybe they just didn't cover the story, all right? But I did find, as I said, that there were some prominent Jewish Houstonians who did disrupt the racial order, and some people who in their day-to-day interactions disrupted that order. And the name Abe Zindler continues to be historically connected to allyship. C.F. Richardson's son recalled his commitment to advertising in The Informer, the fact that he never bowed to Klan pressure, the fact that he joined the NAACP, and also in terms of local history, Abe Zindler also served as mayor of Bel Air, 1937 to 43, and then 1945 to 47. And as I said, of course, there was a growing multi-ethnic mix in many of these neighborhoods as well. And those spatial connections disrupted the idea of segregated space and keeping races apart. I think these stories are significant because they link histories that are often told separately. We know that the Klan targeted Blacks and Jews, but we haven't talked about how they overlapped. The anti-Semitism directed at Abe Zindler was intertwined with the anti-Blackness that targeted C.F. Richardson. Furthermore, both of those Houstonians, a store owner and a newspaper publisher, show how the history of Jewish entrepreneurship is intertwined with the history of Black entrepreneurship. So these are not separate stories. And that's why I think Houston's history is not just a local history. This city challenges us as historians and people who love history to reassess the way that we talk about the past. The experiences of diverse Houstonians disrupts the binary thinking that somehow clouds the way that historians write and teach about race and ethnicity. Houston gives us a window into how to talk about our increasingly polycultural world. Thank you for listening.